Hello, people. Today, me and Ahilleas are going to discuss some questions regarding philosophy, Hegel, and our upcoming course on the science of logic. So, the questions we want to ask today is why study philosophy? Why study Hegel? And why the bloody heck would you study the science of logic?
Yeah, because we've been going on for a while now, talking about it as if it's pretty obvious, and and it might not be. So yeah, let's start with the really general question of why study philosophy in the first place. Um, and now I feel like I'm back in the classroom with some first year undergrads, who I had to convince that they were doing this course for the right reasons.
Well, what would you tell them? Of course, to become wise. So what else? What
Yeah.
else? Do you not
So there are
want
a
to
lot,
become wise?
there are lots of ways to approach the question, why study philosophy? The most immediate one that comes to mind, and that's probably because the answer I've given most, because for numerous reasons, society favors more practical answers than theoretical answers. Um, you study philosophy because philosophy gives you great critical thinking skills. Um, I think aside from being trivial and maybe slightly facetious, I think it is true that philosophy does sharpen your mind in the sense that it forces you to not only think about questions in more abstract terms than the way you would encounter ideas in everyday life. In everyday life, you don't encounter problems abstractly, you encounter concrete problems.
Yes.
And that's obviously challenging, it has its own challenges, but it's a different way of engaging with a problem. Whereas philosophy, typically, unless you do something like applied ethics, will propose to you a problem that's slightly more abstract, slightly more maybe universal in character.
Yeah.
And the way that your mind has to approach that will be significantly different to how you deal with things in a normal, ordinary, sort of everyday kind of way. And and that process of getting to think in a certain way and getting to pass a problem into discrete aspects of it and to think about each one in turn and to think about how they all hang together. Do they hang together? I think that's a really that's a great skill to have as a philosopher per se, but also it's a great skill that you can carry with you in your life.
Yes. Um, I I would say to maybe challenge you, I would say that philosophy is the most practical discipline. At first, it seems abstract because what we're doing, we're just picking apart arguments, trying to figure out, what is God, what is being, what is logic, taking apart all these concepts. But at the end of the day, what are people doing? People go around thinking all the time. They desire things. Well, how do you know you desire what you think you desire? Do you really want what you think you want? And you're trying to figure out what your friend wants, what your family wants, what your partner wants, um, how we should live together with other people, what do we want to do together, right? So once you start to broaden your mind and look at things in a wider scope, you see that the problems that philosophy try to grapple with are not so abstract after all.
Mm.
It's rather our ordinary sort of day-to-day life that's the abstract one, because we're locking ourselves in to certain patterns of thinking that, oh, I need to have this job because I need to pay the bills, because I need this and that. Well, you can solve problems by getting a raise, getting a different job, moving country, etc., right? Or you can change the source yourself. You can think about, well, why do I really want those kinds of things? Why do am I, thinking that this is important? Is this thing essential, right? Philosophy gives you the tools to turn those issues on yourself and dig into the heart of things.
Mm.
And in that respect, I think it is the most practical one, actually.
Yeah, very good. Yes, that's true. That's a very sneaky little philosophical move you did there.
Yeah, and I could not have done it without you doing that setup, Elias.
I am, if I knew a basketball reference, I would say it now, but I don't. Um, but I think, in a way, what you've said brings us nicely onto why one should study Hegel, because a lot of the things, I mean, in a very general sense, a lot of Hegel's philosophy is very applicable to life. If you look at something like the phenomenology of spirit, where he talks about desire and reason and um, other things like religion and art, for example, these things, the way Hegel talks about these concepts makes you reflect on how you think about them and will, one way or another, affect how you think about them because his arguments are just so persuasive and powerful.
Hmm.
Um, Now, in the logic, of course, which is the course that you'll be teaching, this is a slightly different situation.
Yeah, we'll wait with the logic. Let's work on the Hegel
Okay,
question
let's
first.
look on the Hegel. Okay, fine. All right.
Yeah.
So, do you want to jump in on the phenomenology of spirit or Hegel more generally?
I'll jump in on Hegel more generally. So one of the things that I find endlessly fascinating with Hegel is that the way he analyzes and examines things is that um, we often think we have certain ideas and ideals and conclusions and truths that we hold sacred and self-evident.
Hmm.
And things go wrong in Hegel's analysis when we think that we've reached the top, when we've reached the final conclusion, when we are the most certain about something, that's when we make the biggest mistake. And we sort of um, we uh, we uh, we turn over into this the exact opposite of what we wanted in the first place. And he shows this, multiple times throughout his own philosophy. But Hegel shows that because he thinks that's often how history goes. So the French Revolution started out with lots of ideals about equality and justice, and then it turns into this absolute terror. So we have these tendencies of going from one extreme to the other. And Hegel is someone who sort of takes this feature of our reality seriously and unpacks it using argument and logic and makes it very persuasive.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial aspect of Hegel's philosophy to bring forth. I think it's also something about Hegel's philosophy that maybe is not often appreciated. It's a philosophy that encourages you to think it encourages one to think about concepts or objects or what have you in a much more dynamic way, to not just think of things as they present themselves, but to consider aspects of it that maybe you would have thought were antithetical to them
Yes.
or had nothing to do with them. And it sort of makes you confront the possibility that really what you thought was in one way and that could never include these things, like, let's say, the French Revolution and the Terror, to take Hegel's example, in fact, are fundamentally intertwined. And you couldn't possibly have one without the other, which, again, is something that just goes down to a granular level for Hegel. And just thinking about the world, concepts, events in that way is I think it's a very refreshing way to look at things
Mhm.
because the world is messy. Things aren't neatly cut around to delineate them from other things. And I think the more you study Hegel's philosophy, the more you realize that it's actually a very accurate depiction of how things are. Things aren't just black and white. They might present themselves in that way, but really, if you look a bit deeper and unravel what they're made of, you'll find that they're actually more complex.
Yes, but I find that Hegel shows us why it's messy.
Yeah,
And it's messy in large part because we want it to be black and white.
yes,
We want things to be just this or that, right? This is the right politics. This is the right way to run a family. This is who I am. Identify with this. I have just this one identity, whatever, right? And the moment we turn into this kind of gear of looking at things in those terms, well, that's when things get messy
yeah,
because multiple people, multiple groups want their own sort of black and white things, and they naturally come into collision with one another.
mm. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
But you mentioned something I think is also super interesting with Hegel, and that is the his fluid thinking, which really kind of goes down to the granular level of um, just thinking about the thing you're thinking about, that it itself changes the moment you think of it. We like to
Yeah,
think of things as, the positive is just positive and the negative is just negative. Well, actually,
yeah, absolutely.
maybe
Um,
that's a nice segue to science and logic.
right, because the Science of Logic is the book of Hegel's writing where that granular fluidity is put on display.
Yes.
Um, because we're talking about the most fundamental categories, determinations, concepts of thought. And we're looking at how the things that we took for granted, as, in the sense of we obviously knew what they were, things like, you know, something or nothing or infinity, are actually much more nuanced than what we thought they were.
Yeah.
And in fact richer for it as we discover as we go through it, the whole process. Something we haven't spoken about though is maybe we'll touch on this a bit later is the systematicity because we've spoken a lot about how Hegel's thinking has this dynamism to it, but it's also systematic.
Yes.
And
What
I
does
think
that
that's
mean?
that's another great reason for why one should study Hegel.
How so? In what way?
Well, I think what's when I all I can speak about is how I approach it. When I first got into Hegel, what I was drawn into was the possibility uh, of a kind uh, of explanation for why certain things are necessary that could be generally convincing.
Hmm.
And the way Hegel's science of logic develops, the reasons he gives for why things move from one to the other, um, I think in many respects that is what sets Hegel apart from all other thinkers. It's the way he 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 uses his, let's say, his dialectical thinking um, to show how all these determinations of thought hang together, and not just hang together, but are intertwined with one another. How one is nothing by itself, and how they're all part of this ontological whole.
Hmm.
And I think that sort of systematicity gives one a sense of satisfaction, I think
Hmm.
is the word that we have to use. It's
Hmm.
satisfying to have an articulable reason for why, one determination develops into another and why it's this way and not that way.
Yeah.
If someone wants to know what infinity is or what nothing is, Hegel's got an answer for that.
Yeah. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Indeed, indeed. He's got an answer for that. And it's an articulable answer. It's, I think, persuasive. Someone else might disagree, but but and that's all because of the systematic approach that he takes. And of course, this stretches beyond the logic into his whole system, the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit.
Yes.
But what do you think about systematicity and more
So,
generally the question of why someone should study philosophy?
well, we've talked about philosophy. I think we're now answering the question, why study the science of logic?
Yeah.
I believe we moved into the third question. On the point of systematicity, we can approach it from 2 points, from 2 angles. So the first one is, well, for someone who's already interested in systematicity and finds great joy in it, they don't need to
Mm,
be convinced of systematicity. They just need to be convinced of Hegel's systematicity being worthwhile. And it's worthwhile in the sense that, as Ahilleas was saying, the concepts and determinations that Hegel sort of deals with, they develop out of one another. They prove to be this and that, right? They and that forms a kind of chain or rational chain, you might say,
mm,
and that is the systematicity that they are systematically kind of tied together through their development, through what they turn out to be. And what's interesting here is that this isn't something that Hegel just like plans ahead. He goes into whatever concept he starts out with. We'll, deal with the beginnings. That's a topic unto itself. And then analyzes it, examines it, thinks what it must be implied in it, and it turns out to be something else. And that it turns out to be something else is interesting, Hegel thinks, because that means that the thought, something's happened to the thought, and I need to trace that. Um, so he doesn't sort of presuppose or plan the end. He develops the system as the concepts themselves develop, basically.
mm,
So that's the first thing. But if somebody's not convinced of systematicity, then they need to be convinced of that idea in and of itself, which is a lot of people who might not be convinced by systematicity. And a lot of philosophers too will, a lot of modern philosophers will not buy that idea. Like, what do you mean systematicity? Why? Right? Philosophy is just this and that philosopher doing his or her thing and making an account of things. How can there be any systematicity? And I think we can go back to what you were saying, Helios, that there's something rationally satisfying with a good argument, with figuring
mm,
things out. And what's better than figuring things out is figuring many things out together. So figuring one thing out leads to another figuring thing out.
hmm
And this way you kind of make a chain of many happy things taking place. And that just is the systematicity, sort of from a roughly put. But you're just linking things together and seeing the path they all make. And that's there isn't anything more to the systematicity than that. As I've already said, Hegel's system is kind of an open system, right? It's not planned ahead of time. It's going to end so and so. It is what it turns out to be as we examine it.
And I think that's a crucial point to make as well, because many people approach Hegel's logic with a sort of skepticism that it's sort of treated as a kind of like a holy text in a way. And that's probably partially our fault. But a lot of what we do is interrogating whether or not Hegel has done something correctly. And that, in a sense, is the beauty of it, that it's open to that kind of interrogation.
Yes. And Hegel himself builds on Kant, who builds on Hume and Spinoza. So implicitly, all philosophers are already forming part of a system because they're all responding to each other and figuring out concepts and arguments, figuring out, well, what is this kind of thing, reality that we're all living in, and how should we live together in a society, right? So there is already a system there. Hegel's just making it explicit. He's just like digging it out of the ground,
Yeah.
like digging it up out of the ground and pointing, look at all these ruins, all these attempts at building the system. This has been going on since philosophy was a thing.
Yeah, in many ways, the science of logic is just a very long conversation
Yeah.
uh, of between the numerous voices in the history of thought, I would say more generally. Philosophy, perhaps more obviously, but also other non-philosophical thought. Um, yeah, that's what
Yeah.
makes such an exciting text.
Yeah. So I think if you're somebody who is curious and wants to figure out how things work, figure things out, interrogate the big questions, join the ongoing conversation that's been going on for 2,500 years, maybe this is something of interest to you.
Yeah. And if you don't like systematicity and you're inherently skeptical about systematicity, it's all the more reason to get involved because this is it- one of the most successful attempts at systematicity. So, get stuck in, get critical, and if Hegel doesn't convince you, no one will convince you. But if anyone can convince you, it will be Hegel.
But that's a great point, Helios. Even if it
Yeah,
doesn't convince you, then you should know why, right? And
yeah,
then we'll learn something. Like whatever Hegel was after and how he was doing it somehow wasn't good enough. And maybe you'll be the person to expose that. And then we can build the next iteration of the system that incorporates that dissatisfaction.
indeed,
Yeah,
indeed.
or like response to it. But I think, yeah, it's very important to, as you were saying, Elias, to test these things out for oneself. And if you're skeptical, you know, all the more reason to challenge yourself.
Yeah. I think we've successfully answered the three questions you set out, Philip.
It's a good first stab at it, I think. Yeah. All right, people. Well, thanks for tuning in. We hope some of this sounded interesting, and leave us some comments and questions of what you would like to hear more of in terms of Hegel, philosophy, or the science of logic. We'll try to get to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.